The Texas sun hung low over a wide open field. Heat shimmered above the grass, where church bells drifted faintly across the wind. From the dusty road, a convoy of olive-green trucks came to a stop beside a white wooden chapel. The engines fell silent, replaced by the distant hum of laughter and music. Japanese prisoners of war stepped cautiously down, their khaki uniforms stiff, their faces unreadable. Each movement was measured, uncertain. Some shielded their eyes, scanning the crowd of American families spreading picnic blankets, children chasing one another through the grass, women arranging food on long wooden tables. A few soldiers whispered quietly in disbelief. Was this an inspection? A test of obedience? Or some new method of interrogation wrapped in smiles? Guards stood nearby, rifles slung but relaxed, their posture strangely unthreatening. The POWs hesitated, unsure of what to make of this scene, where kindness felt like a trap and laughter sounded foreign. But to understand this strange moment, we must step back to see how Japanese prisoners of war found themselves in the heart of America. Chantrefrisi. In the Pacific War, surrender was not an option. It was a disgrace. From the earliest days of Imperial Japan's military expansion, soldiers were taught that capture equaled eternal shame. The code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, demanded absolute loyalty, even unto death. To die for the emperor was not tragedy, but duty. To live as a prisoner was to lose one's honor, one's family, and one's place in the nation's soul. This mindset shaped some of the most brutal fighting of the war. On the islands of Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, entire units chose death over surrender. Civilians followed soldiers off cliffs rather than face capture. American troops learned that every cave, every ridge, could be a suicide ambush. Few Japanese soldiers were expected, or allowed, to live as prisoners. Yet as the war dragged into its final years, reality began to overtake ideology. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps captured increasing numbers of wounded or unconscious soldiers, their refusal to die overridden by exhaustion or injury. From these shattered beaches and jungles, thousands of men were sent east, not to execution, as they had been told, but to the unlikeliest of destinations, the American heartland. By 1945, more than 5,000 Japanese POWs had been transported to camps across the United States. Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas, quiet farmlands thousands of miles from Tokyo, became home to men once prepared to die for their emperor. They were guarded, fed, and housed under the Geneva Convention, a code of conduct Japan itself had never signed. For the first time, these soldiers saw their captors not as demons, but as men following another kind of order. Here, in these strange, sunlit camps, their war would take a different turn. Life inside America's prisoner-of-war camps was a contradiction in every sense. Behind barbed wire and wooden guard towers, order prevailed. Yet within those fences, daily life carried a strange normalcy. The men rose early, marched in formation, and saluted their officers. But instead of battle drills, they were assigned to fields, sawmills, or canning plants. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could work, not as punishment, but as laborers paid a small wage. Many Japanese POWs found themselves harvesting cotton in Texas or picking fruit in California, work once done by American farm hands gone to war. The sun was fierce, the soil dry, and the rhythm of the land demanded endurance. But unlike the battlefield, the danger here was gone. Guards watched from a distance, their weapons mostly symbolic. Some even shared water or cigarettes during breaks, small gestures that unsettled the prisoners more than open hostility ever could. In the evenings, camp loudspeakers played American radio, country songs, war updates, sometimes even baseball games. A few prisoners gathered near the wire, listening in silence to words they didn't understand. trying to reconcile this gentler face of the enemy with the propaganda they'd grown up with. Letters home were censored but permitted. Medical care was given freely. And when illness or injury struck, American doctors treated their captives with professionalism, not vengeance. Slowly, quietly, the image of the merciless barbarian enemy began to dissolve. For many POWs, this was the first time they experienced freedom within captivity. The freedom to think, to question, to see the humanity of the other side. But among all these quiet revelations, one day stood apart. It was neither a battle nor a punishment, but something stranger. A moment so foreign that even the most disciplined soldiers couldn't comprehend it. The day the prisoners were invited to a church picnic. To the Japanese prisoners, the invitation made no sense. A church picnic, the words themselves felt like a trap. In their world, the enemy never mixed kindness with control. Everything in military life had purpose, and every gesture carried meaning. So when the American Guards announced that a group of local civilians wished to host a gathering to share food and fellowship, most of the POWs assumed it was a form of psychological warfare. They had been trained to resist deceit, to expect manipulation disguised as mercy. The Imperial Army had long warned that Americans used trickery to extract confessions or test loyalty. Some believed they were being watched, that hidden agents would record their behavior and report disobedience back to Japan. Even as they were told it was voluntary, suspicion remained. Why would a nation at war feed its prisoners like guests? Why music, laughter, and prayer for men they had fought only months before? For many, it felt insulting, a humiliation wrapped in politeness. The prisoners cleaned their uniforms that morning, more out of habit than belief. Some tucked small photos of family under their belts, as if expecting the worst. To them, this wasn't a picnic. It was an examination of their will, a study in foreign absurdity. The buses that came to collect them stirred quiet dread, not curiosity. And yet, beneath the fear, a faint and unspoken question lingered. Could this kindness be real? For the Americans, the gesture came from faith, not strategy. In the small Texas town near the camp, the local church had debated for weeks whether compassion toward the enemy was naive or necessary. Many had lost sons in the Pacific, and the grief was still raw. But the pastor, a former chaplain himself, argued that mercy was a form of victory, that forgiveness proved moral strength in the aftermath of violence. So the congregation gathered what they had: sandwiches, fresh fruit, lemonade, and a handful of musical instruments. Farmers, teachers, and families volunteered, determined to show that humanity could survive even through the bitterness of war. Children painted banners that read "Peace and Friendship," though few expected the visitors to understand the words. To them, the prisoners were no longer faceless enemies, but tired young men far from home. The war had ended, and in this corner of America, people wanted to believe that kindness could help close the distance between nations. Even the guards felt the weight of the moment. They were instructed to stay armed but approachable, to maintain safety without intimidation. It was an experiment in reconciliation, carried out on a patch of grass under an open sky. No, one knew what to expect when the trucks finally arrived, only that the moment would test both sides in ways no battlefield ever had. Then came the moment that broke both fear and silence: the picnic itself. The morning air was heavy with the warmth of late summer. The convoy rolled slowly through the dirt road toward the small clearing beside the white-painted church. Wildflowers bent in the wind as the trucks came to a stop. Guards stepped down first, scanning the perimeter, their rifles slung but idle. Beyond the fence, a modest crowd waited. Men in rolled-up sleeves, women in cotton dresses, children holding paper flags and picnic baskets. Tables stood beneath the oak trees, lined with simple food: bread, fried chicken, corn on the cob, and bright jars of lemonade glinting in the sun. A radio played faintly from the back of a pickup truck, filling the air with the rhythm of an unfamiliar country song. When the first group of POWs was escorted out, the chatter died down. The Japanese soldiers, standing in careful formation, kept their eyes low, hands rigid at their sides. Every movement of the Americans was studied. The smiles, the open gestures, the casual way they interacted. Nothing fit the image they had been taught of the cruel and arrogant conqueror. Some of the prisoners refused to sit. Others stood motionless, waiting for commands that never came. They watched the civilians laugh freely, watched the guards eat with them, and tried to understand what kind of war permitted this kind of peace. The pastor stepped forward, offering a short prayer through a loudspeaker, words of thanksgiving and remembrance. The prisoners didn't understand the language, but the tone was calm, reverent, and strangely gentle. The meal began. Still, the POWs stood in silence, uncertain if they were truly meant to take part. It was the strangest battlefield any of them had ever seen. One built not on fear, but on trust. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, an American woman, elderly, wearing a faded blue dress, walked toward the nearest table. She held a plate of food, her hands slightly trembling, but her eyes kind. She stopped before a young prisoner who couldn't have been more than 20. His uniform hung loose, his face thin, sunburned, and wary. Without a word, she extended the plate toward him. Bread, meat, and fruit, offered not as command, but as invitation. The boy hesitated. Around him, his comrades watched, frozen in disbelief. He bowed slightly, uncertain, then reached out with both hands and accepted. The woman smiled faintly, nodded, and returned to her place. Nothing more was said. But that single motion, a plate passed from one hand to another, broke something invisible. The guards relaxed their posture. The prisoners, slowly, cautiously, began to eat. Within minutes, the field transformed. Laughter returned, tentative at first, then real. Children wandered closer to the rows of men in khaki. A few prisoners smiled back. One of them pointed curiously at the guitar a young American strummed near the tables. What began as a tense exercise in diplomacy turned into a quiet communion. The prisoners, still unable to understand the words around them, understood something far more universal: kindness without condition. Later, a few POWs would write in their journals that it was the first time since capture they had felt like human beings again. And, for the Americans, it was the first time they saw their former enemies not as soldiers, but as sons. In that moment, the war ended not in gunfire, but in a quiet exchange of humanity. That evening, when the trucks carried the Japanese prisoners back to camp, the mood was unrecognizable. The silence that had once hung over every return was replaced by a low murmur of voices. Inside the barracks, men sat in small circles, recounting the strange kindness of the day. Some still suspected it was a tactic, perhaps to test their loyalty or lure them into complacency. But others, quietly, admitted they had felt something different. A softening, an unsettling warmth that did not fit into military logic. In the weeks that followed, a few of the camp interpreters were asked to record the prisoners' impressions. Their notes, preserved in wartime archives, reveal a rare shift in tone. One prisoner wrote, "I do not understand why the enemy would treat us this way. Perhaps their strength comes not from weapons, but from heart." Another described feeling ashamed that he had once wished to die rather than be captured, realizing now that survival could also be honorable. Letters home were censored, but traces of that day appeared between the lines, coded mentions of a gathering of peace or food shared among enemies. For men raised to believe that mercy was weakness, this encounter dismantled an entire worldview. Psychologists later noted how such gestures reduced aggression and improved discipline within the camps. Escape attempts dropped. Fights ceased. Many prisoners began studying English. reading the Bible, or volunteering for extra labor. The hostility that had defined their identity was replaced by curiosity. A quiet, human curiosity about the people who had once been their mortal foes. The picnic, though brief, had changed something fundamental within them, something that would travel home long after the war was over. When the war ended, and the ships began carrying Japanese prisoners back across the Pacific, many left the United States with mixed emotions. They were returning to a homeland in ruins, cities burned, families displaced, an empire dismantled. Yet some carried with them a quiet conviction that the enemy they had feared was not what they had imagined. Interviews conducted years later revealed how those small acts of humanity shaped their reintegration. A former sergeant recalled telling his village that Americans prayed before eating and shared food even with captives. Another wrote that he had seen kindness as strength, something Japan needed in rebuilding. These accounts circulated among veterans and scholars, influencing early post-war pacifist movements and the Christian humanitarian efforts that flourished in the late 1940s. In Japan's reconstruction, understanding the moral character of the United States became essential to diplomacy. The generation of men who had been POWs often served as informal bridges, translating not just language, but empathy. Some became teachers, priests, or peace advocates. Their first-hand experiences countered the wartime propaganda that had once dehumanized both sides. For the Americans involved, the memory lingered as well. Church members kept letters of thanks written years after the event. Local newspapers from Texas and Oklahoma recorded the story of the picnic for the enemy, preserving it as a symbol of faith's quiet defiance against hatred. What had begun as an afternoon experiment in forgiveness became, over time, a thread in the larger fabric of reconciliation between two nations once divided by total war. Decades later, historians would look back at these gestures as small yet powerful acts of reconciliation. History often records wars through numbers: battles won, lives lost, treaties signed. Yet, within those vast movements of strategy and destruction, it is the smallest human moments that quietly redefine what victory truly means. The church. Picnic in that Texas field was not a military operation, nor an official act of diplomacy. It was something far rarer, an expression of empathy strong enough to reach across language, ideology, and the ruins of war. For the Japanese prisoners, the experience dismantled beliefs built over a lifetime. They had been told that mercy was weakness, that surrender erased honor. Yet here, surrounded by people who should have despised them, they found a kindness that neither demanded loyalty nor sought revenge. In that sunlight, they discovered the unsettling truth that strength could also mean gentleness. For the Americans, the act was equally transformative. Many had lost brothers and sons to the very army these prisoners had served. Still, they chose to answer violence with grace. In doing so, they proved that the ideals they fought for, freedom, faith, and humanity, could survive even the darkest of wars. Empathy, in that moment, did what weapons could not. It pierced the armor of propaganda, replaced suspicion with understanding, and reminded both sides that beyond uniform and flag, men are bound by the same fragile thread of decency. Decades later, when historians pieced together this quiet encounter, it stood as a symbol of how peace begins, not in grand gestures or signed documents, but in the simple act of seeing one another as human again. The war had taken millions, scarred nations, and reshaped the world. Yet in one forgotten corner of America, amid laughter, prayer, and shared food, a handful of people proved that compassion itself can be a victory, the kind that leaves no graves behind.